In the current, everything around you moves. Nothing stands still. In the current, rough stones are smoothed and new paths are formed. In the current, you are led where it leads, not always where you've planned. In the current, you are always on a journey, and the current is the way.
Imagine with me, if you will, the perfect community. What would be the top attributes of the perfect society? The perfect characteristics of a perfect community? What would it be? I think we can easily come to mind things like it would be safe, it would be peaceful, people would be prosperous, we would be healthy. And I think we could probably all agree on probably 5 or 6 or maybe even 10 things that would be the attributes or the characteristics of a perfect community or a perfect society. But then when we start to dig down into that, we find that each of us might have different definitions of what perfect might be. We might find ourselves at disagreements with the idea that what you find perfect, I find, well, we can do without that, or maybe we need more of that than you think. So as I was thinking about what are the attributes of a perfect community, I decided that I would search the most intelligent resource on earth. And so I went online and asked ChatGPT, what are the top 5 attributes of a perfect society? And I asked the question 3 or 4 different ways to see what it would produce and what are the top 5 attributes of a perfect society, what are the characteristics of a community, and it came up with 5 sort of repeated values. And these are the 5. The first it came up with are equity and justice. You realize that ChatGPT is no smarter than the people that program it. So sustainability was the second one, focusing on ecological issues. Community and connection, that's a good one. I think that's a value we could agree on. Education and empowerment, that was number 4. And number 5 were health and well-being. And while I didn't really necessarily agree with all of those in that order, I thought, well, that's not a bad start. So I asked it another set of questions. I said, what reasons are there? What are the top reasons why a perfect community doesn't exist? Why doesn't a perfect society exist? And it gave me 5 reasons. And the first one is human nature. And I agree with that one. We call that sin. We are all selfish and self-centered, and that prevents us from having a perfect community. It then split it out. It said diversity of values and beliefs. That's true. Resource limitations. Everyone can't have everything. Social structures and systems. Change and adaptation, it said, were the 5th things. And these are good and reasonable answers. But they're wrong. You see, ChatGPT didn't include what I think is the most significant reason why we cannot and do not experience a perfect community or a perfect society. Over the next 3 weeks, as we make our way to the celebration of Thanksgiving, I want us to probe deeply into what I think is the primary reason, the most important reason why we cannot and do not experience our communities and our societies and our church as a perfect place. And hopefully over these next 3 weeks, I'm inviting you to dedicate 3 hours over this month leading up to Thanksgiving to wrestle with the idea of the why and the what of how we can participate in making the world around us better. So that when we get to Thanksgiving, we will not only know why we should give thanks, we can be reminded of exactly how to do it. Imagine that, a Thanksgiving for which we are truly thankful. But before we enter into that molecular examination, would you pray with me? Father in heaven, I would ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be pleasing in your sight, that you would use your words spoken by your servant and anointed by your Spirit to challenge us to be generous, to be gracious, and to be grateful. Pray that for myself and for my family and for all of us here. For I ask that in Jesus' name. Amen. 2,000 years ago, the city of Austin existed on the northern part of the Peloponnesian Peninsula. Try saying that 3 times fast. Peloponnesian Peninsula. I like saying that. It just sounds really cool. And the Peloponnesian Peninsula is located in between the Ionian and the Aegean Seas in the southern part of Greece, 50 miles southwest of the great city of Athens. 2,000 years ago, the city of Austin was not called Austin, it was called Corinth. When Diane and I were married for 2 weeks, we got married, went on our honeymoon, came home, packed up everything we owned in the 1969 the Ford LTD that her parents gave us as a wedding gift that her uncle had painted canary yellow with a black vinyl top. We loaded everything we owned in that and moved from Pennsylvania to Dallas, Texas to go to graduate school. We wound up staying in Dallas for 22 years. Not because we didn't finish graduate school, although it felt like 22 years, but the reality is my first church, our first ministry base was in Richardson, Texas. All 3 of our daughters were born in Dallas, Texas. I loved living in Dallas. Dallas in the 1980s was a place of incredible optimism. I had come from the Northeast where their first answer is, why would you want to do that? To Dallas where everyone would go, why not? Let's try it. In the 80s, I was convinced if you threw a brick out of a building, out of a window, a building would sprout up. It was optimistic. And imagine this, the Cowboys were really good. And so we lived in Dallas, and it was hard when we first moved to Dallas, for the first few years we lived there, to find anyone who was actually born in Texas. Everybody in Dallas was from somewhere else, just like us. But after we got settled in Dallas and I began my first ministry there in Richardson, I began to meet 2nd and 3rd and 4th generation Texans. And all of these native Texans who lived in Dallas would tell me the same thing. When I make enough money, or when I retire, I'm moving to the hill country. And everybody we met had this irrational affection for the hill country and the area around Austin. And it's because Austin is a place like Corinth. It was a city of second chances. It was a city of new beginnings. It was a city where you could begin again and where you could start over. After your business failed or your marriage failed or whether you were looking to begin something new, Corinth was the place. Because Corinth was a hub of creativity and invention and entrepreneurial activity. And the city of Corinth had a reputation. Archaeologists tell us that people had lived there on the Corinthian Isthmus for almost 7,000 years. There's evidence that 5,000 years before Christ, there were people living in the Corinthian Isthmus. And at 3,000 years BC, at 3000 BC, the city of Corinth was one of the larger cities in the Mediterranean basin. But the people of Corinth had a reputation for hundreds of generations as being people who just didn't conform. They were misfits, they were outcasts, they were nonconformists, they were rebels. And this would cause problems with the ruling empires who came and went throughout the Mediterranean basin. Whether it was the Assyrians or the Persians or the Greeks or the Romans, the Corinthians were always, we're Corinthians, and you're not the boss of us. Finally, the Romans got tired of it, and in 146 BC, they sent a Roman legion under the command of a general named Mummius with orders to destroy Corinth. And he took it literally. Mummius invaded Corinth and he killed every male person above the age of 12. And they took into captivity those children and women who survived. They then tore every building down and burned the city to the ground. And for the better part of 100 years, no one lived in the region of Corinth. It was in 44 BC that Julius Caesar said, this is too valuable of a throughway between the Ionian and Aegean seas, between southern Greece and northern Greece. We need to have a Roman city there. So he deeded to 16,000 free Roman citizens property on the Corinthian isthmus, and they recolonized Corinth in 44 BC. Over 100 years later, in 51 AD, when the Apostle Paul first visited the city of Corinth had over 700,000 people living in the Corinthian region. 200,000 of them were free Roman citizens. 500,000 of them were expatriates and slaves. When the Apostle Paul came in March of 51 AD to begin his evangelistic efforts in Corinth, he found that he couldn't do it traditionally because he got kicked out of what few synagogues were there. So he preached in the pagan temples and in the marketplace, the agora, and he debated the scholars in the public square. And he was there for 18 months until September of 52 AD. And during that time, the Corinthian church was born. And it was a unique place. It was unlike any of the other churches that the Apostle Paul had planted, because it was such a diverse and eclectic group of pagans and Gentiles and Jews and rich and poor and slaves and free. But it was all Corinthians, all people who wanted to do things their own way. Well, it didn't take long before the young Corinthian church began to tear itself apart. And it was a few years later when the Apostle Paul was at his home base in Ephesus in Turkey, when word came to him that the Corinthian church was about to blow up and dissolve, that there were fractions and factions fighting with one another inside the Corinthian church. So in February of 56 AD, the Apostle Paul wrote a letter to the Corinthian church, and it's been preserved in your Bibles. It is what we call 1 Corinthians. It's 16 chapters of affirmation and encouragement, of guidance to say, this is how you create a better community. This is how you build something special together as a fellowship of faith. And at the center of that letter, which is 16 chapters long, is 1 Corinthians chapter 13, an entire chapter dedicated to love. And the letter was sent, and the Apostle Paul decided, I'm going to make my way to Corinth. I'm going to revisit some of the churches that I had planted a few years before, and I'm going to make my way to Corinth to see if I can't help them sort things out. But on his way, just about 6 months later, when he was in Macedonia, in the churches at Thessalonica and Philippi, he received word that the people in Corinth had rejected his letter. In fact, they had rejected him entirely as an apostle. There were groups of people who were saying, you're not an apostle. You weren't one of the original 12. You're not the boss of us. You can't tell us what to do or how to behave. So from there in Philippi, the Apostle Paul wrote the second letter that we have, 2 Corinthians. And 2 Corinthians is much more confrontational, much more directive, much more correcting. And at the center of those 13 chapters of that second epistle are 2 chapters that focus on the one thing that is at the nucleus of a healthy community. In a dysfunctional society, in a society that is prone to tearing itself apart, in 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9, the Apostle Paul says it's not about you. It's about what you do for others. It's about what you give, not about what you have. What I want to do over the next 3 weeks is I want to take a theological electron microscope and look into a handful of verses from the nucleus of this encouragement to be others-centered. If we are going to see anything like a healthy community or a healthy society, it requires that we be others-centered. It requires us to be sacrificial. It requires us to be generous. And I want to drill down today, down in 2 Corinthians 9, down at verse 6. In 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 6, the Apostle Paul says, remember this thing. The one who sows sparingly will reap sparingly. And the one who sows generously will reap generously. Now, there's no doubt that in the Corinthian church, very few of the people were farmers. And I know at Riverbend Church, very few of you are farmers. Some of you have ranches, and some of you have chickens, and you consider yourself farmers, but you're not farmers because you have chickens. See, I grew up on farms. My father's parents and my mother's parents both had dairy farms in eastern Pennsylvania. And I was condemned or sentenced or sent to the farm every summer. So as soon as school got out at the end of the spring and before fall, I spent that working on the farm. And so I learned very early on that what you did on a farm is you ate what you grew. And we had a couple 100 acres on my mother's parents' farm, and on that farm we grew hay and corn, and we had cows and we had pigs and we had chickens. But we also had what my grandmother called a truck patch. Never sure why it was called a truck patch. It was about 5 acres, and it was all the vegetables that would feed our family for the whole year. And there were corn, and there were beans, and there were beets, and there were potatoes, and there were tomatoes, and there were all these kind of vegetables. And as a kid, I was an idiot because I didn't like vegetables. And I wanted store-bought vegetables. I didn't want the vegetables out of Grandma's cellar. What a moron. What I wouldn't give to have those shelves and shelves of mason jars of organically raised, fresh, preserved vegetables that we grew. But when you grow up on a farm, you realize that's how you survive. You eat what you grow. And while I didn't like vegetables, there was one vegetable that I loved above all others, and that was corn. Now I know you think you know corn. You don't know corn. Because we grew 2 kinds of corn. We grew yellow corn that we called cow corn. This was the stuff that we gave to the cows and the pigs. But in the truck patch, we grew white, sweet corn. There's a brand called Silver Queen. If you were to understand what it's like, it's vegetable crack is what it is. I could literally eat an acre of corn at one sitting. It was the most marvelous vegetable on the planet. But I learned something about corn. You know how corn works? Corn is what we eat are the kernels that are literally the seeds of the corn. And on one corn stalk, usually if it germinates fully, there's 1 corn cob, sometimes 2. Usually there were 2. Very rarely there were 3 corn cobs on a single corn stalk. On a corn cob, on one ear of corn, there were between 800 and 1,200 kernels of corn. Each of those kernels is a seed that if you pulled them off of the cob and dried them and the next spring planted them in the right conditions, each of those seeds would produce a stalk of corn that would produce at least 1, maybe 2 or 3 ears of corn. Which means if the average ear of corn has between 800 and 1,200 kernels on it, if 800 of those seeds from 1 ear of corn germinated when you planted them in the ground, after 1 year, you would have 640,000 kernels of corn. If each corn stalk had 2 kernels of corn on it, you would have 1,280,000 kernels of corn from 1 ear of corn in 1 year. This is the law of sowing and reaping. This is what Paul is talking about when he says those who sow generously will reap generously. But you know what is at the essence of the law of sowing and reaping? You can't eat it. You can't keep it. You gotta put it in the ground. The one who sows sparingly will reap sparingly, but the one who sows generously will reap generously. It is the law of multiplication. When I first came to Riverbend Church, I asked Dr. Gerald Mann, I said, Gerald, how do you talk to Riverbend Church? Because Riverbend is really icky about money. Riverbend everybody sits on their hands and they're like, oh, don't tell me I have to give. I'm going to some other church where they don't talk about it. We don't like money. And I said, Gerald, how do you talk to him about money? He says, I tell him to do what I do. And Gerald had this thing, and I know that this was his practice. He said, I save 10% and I give 10%. And I spend the hound out of the 80% that's left. And he loved spending the hound out of it. But he practiced what he preached. But you can't reap generously if you don't sow generously. But it's not just about the act of generosity. It's also about the attitude of generosity. In 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 7, the Apostle Paul encourages us to focus on our attitude, on what our attitude, each of you should give, he says, as you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly, not under compulsion, because God loves a cheerful giver. God is like a parent. You ever ask your children to do something and they're like, no, and they slow walk through the chore? If you didn't have a child like that, you didn't raise me, because that's how I was. All of my chores were filled with grumbling and complaining. I can't tell you how many times my parents looked at me and said, well, if that's your attitude, then we'll do it for you. And I'm like, when? But what Paul is saying is not just about the act of giving, it's the attitude of giving. If you have an attitude that's poor, you might as well not even give, because you don't understand it. You need to change your attitude. You need to turn that frown upside down. You ever hear that phrase? You need to turn that frown upside down. I'm going to give you a more toxic phrase than that. I'm going to share with you the most mind virus cliche about generosity that I can possibly share. If you're watching online, in about a minute, I'm going to ask you to mute your audio, because you don't want to hear this. If you have a hearing aid, turn it down. I don't know what to tell the rest of you, because you're going to hear it, and once you hear it, you can't unhear it. It is an earworm that once it gets in there, it will start to eat your brain. And this is not my fault, because someone else planted this virus in me, and that was Stephanie Rollins. You remember Stephanie last week? Brilliant teacher, amazing gift to Riverbend Church. Well, she came back from a retreat a few weeks ago where one of the motivational tactics was to inspire people to have a good attitude, and they introduced her to this mind virus. So if you're online, mute your phone, mute the computer, mute the TV. Now, just mute it. Cut it off. Ready? You want to have a good attitude? You got to turn your boo-ray into a hooray. You get it? Turn your boo-ray into you can't unhear that, can you? Turn your boo-ray into a hooray. You're going to say it. You know you're going to say it. All right, I'm going to tell the people on television right now to go ahead and unmute, and then I'm going to say it, so they're going to hear it anyway, okay? All right, you can turn it back on. Turn back on the sound. Yeah, it's good. It's good because we want to turn your boo-ray into a hooray. But it's about the attitude. Not just about our action, but how do we do it? How do we, other than saying, I'm going to turn my boo-ray into a hooray, how do we do it? It's what's in verse 8. In verse 8, the Apostle Paul says this. He says, and God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things at all times, and you know what all things in all times means? It means all things at all times. Having all that you need, you will abound, you will overflow in good work. You know, we have a tendency to think that giving is an obligation. And we say it like this, well, I have to give. And you're saying the right thing, you're just saying it wrong semantically. You don't have to give, you have to give. You don't get to give, you get to give. We get so that we can give. We have so that we can give. You don't have just to have. You don't get just to get. We have to give and we get to give. Imagine if you were a brilliant chef and you created dishes that exploded people's taste buds, that allowed people to experience viscerally things that they had never experienced before, and you never cooked for anyone. You just made the food for yourself. Imagine if you had a beautiful voice and you sang in the shower and you sang to yourself, but you never shared that. If you were a great writer, or you were a great painter, or you were a brilliant accountant, or a lawyer, or a doctor, and a teacher, or you had the ability and a skill set that you never used to help anyone, how would we define you? We would say you are selfish, because we don't have to have. And you can say that differently too. I don't have to have. I don't have to have. I have to give. I get to give. And Paul doubles down because they were questioning his authority in the Corinthian church. He doesn't say don't just take my word for it. Take the psalmist's word for it. And in verse 9, he quotes from the 112th Psalm. What he says in verse 9 of 2 Corinthians chapter 9 is, he says, as they have freely scattered their gifts among the poor, their righteousness will endure forever. And that's word for word from the 112th Psalm. And the 112th Psalm is a psalm about the confidence that we have that God will care for us, that God has given us everything that we need. It goes like this. Praise the Lord. Blessed are those who fear the Lord, who find great delight in his commands. Their children will be mighty in the land. The generation of the upright will be blessed. Wealth and riches are in their houses, and their righteousness endures forever. Even in darkness, light dawns for the upright, for those who are gracious and compassionate and righteous. Good will come to those who are generous and lend freely, who conduct their affairs with justice. Surely the righteous will never be shaken. They will be remembered forever. They will have no fear of bad news. Their hearts are steadfast, trusting in the Lord. Their hearts are secure. They will have no fear, and they will look in triumph on their foes. And then verse 9 of the 112th Psalm is exactly the 9th verse of 2 Corinthians chapter 9. And they share freely, they scatter their gifts freely among the poor, and their righteousness endures forever. Do any of you know who R.G. Letourneau is? Anybody from the Longview area, from Tyler? If you're from Longview or East Texas, you probably know who Letourneau, R.G. Letourneau is. R.G. Letourneau was a high school dropout who became a heavy machinery mechanic and a welder. And in his early 20s, in 1922, he was working as a heavy machinery mechanic in Stockton, California, when his boss came to him and said, there's a company that needs to modify one of their tractors to move dirt. Can you come up with something that will allow them to move dirt more efficiently? What no one knew was that R.G. Letourneau was an engineering genius. And he invented and designed a very simple piece of attachment that went on a tractor that moved more dirt than anyone had thought possible. And he went on to design other implements and other machines. After a few years, he started a company called the R.G. Letourneau Heavy Machinery Company. By 1945, when World War II was at its height, 70% of the non-combat machinery that the U.S. military used was made by the R.G. Letourneau Company. By the time he retired in 1969, he personally held over 300 different engineering patents. But what made him so amazing was that he and his wife Evelyn, and it's in his book, it's called Mover of Men and Mountains, they decided that they would use their wealth to promote the gospel. And they decided not to give 10% of their wealth to the promotion of the gospel. They decided that they would live on 10% of their income and give 90% of it away. Over the course of his lifetime, R.G. Letourneau became a billionaire. In 1946, he acquired from the federal government a decommissioned hospital, military hospital in Longview, Texas, and they started a university that was designed to train Christian missionaries and engineers. And it exists today. It's called Letourneau University. It's one of the finest Christian engineering schools in the world. And in his biography, R.G. Letourneau said, someone asked him, how is it that you're so generous? And he said, well, I decided to try to outgive God. And what I found was the faster I shoveled it out, God shoveled it back in. And what I came to realize was that God had a bigger shovel. Only an engineer would say that. Riverbend has its own R.G. Letourneau. His name was Mark Lehman. You saw his story just a few minutes ago. Everyone who knew Mark liked Mark. He was one of those people who was impossible not to like, which is amazing because he made his entire professional career in politics. He was a campaign manager and advisor to presidents and first ladies. He worked in Austin and in Washington, D.C. He eventually became a lobbyist for educators across the state of Texas. And Mark devoted himself to serving here at Riverbend Church. And it was on August the 7th of last year, of 2023, that Mark suddenly died of a heart attack. And we discovered something that none of us knew about Mark Lehman. We knew that Mark was an author. We knew that he had written movie scripts and he had written a book called The Shoebox Chronicles. And that he was a great friend and a great servant, but we had no idea that what you heard John Harrell say in that video was that a year before his death, he had changed his will to leave the entirety of his estate to the Riverbend Church Foundation. Now, you may not know that Riverbend Church has a foundation. We were certified in 2005, the year that I came. And for most of that time, most of the last 20 years, the Riverbend Foundation has operated from a principle of most foundations. The capital in the foundation, the core of the investment, is not to be touched. And what is to be donated is to be the proceeds of the interest off of the capital that's in the foundation. But we really didn't have that much money. Mark changed that. At Mark's death, his estate provided Riverbend Church with the largest single gift in the 20 years that I've been here at Riverbend. You could say that you are sitting in air conditioning today because of Mark Lehman's generosity, because one of the projects that was funded by the foundation over this last year was a new $100,000 air conditioning unit for this building, which was not in our budget, which came because Mark had dedicated himself to sowing a seed. You see, Mark planted a tree. On our farm, we had crops that every year you had to plant new corn, new beans, and new beets, and new potatoes, and new carrots, new tomatoes. But we also had an orchard. And that orchard had been planted by the family who owned the property for generations before my great-grandfather bought it, just about 50 years after the Civil War. And those trees had been planted by a generation of people who they never sat on, they never gathered the fruit from those trees. But every year, we would pick the apples and the pears and the peaches from those trees, and my grandmother would can them, and we would eat them throughout the year, and the next year we would harvest them. We never had to replant them. That's what it means in 2 Corinthians chapter 9 and in Psalm 112 verse 9, when it says that their righteousness endures forever. The Greeks had a word for someone from Corinth. It was Corinthiazomai. It meant to behave like a Corinthian. And it wasn't a compliment, it was pejorative. If you behaved like a Corinthian, it was to behave recklessly. It was to behave in a creative way without responsibility. It was to be a rebel. It was to be an outcast, a misfit. When someone was called a Corinthian, it was not a compliment. It was an indication that you were a rebel. After living in Dallas for 22 years, Diane and I accepted a call to ministry in the San Francisco Bay Area. And we moved from Richardson, Texas to Pleasanton, California. I can tell you there are no two more opposite places on the face of the earth than Dallas, Texas, and San Francisco, California. And I can also tell you that I learned some things when I was in San Francisco, the chief of which is if Dallas and San Francisco had a baby, it would be Austin. Because the creativity and the risk-taking and all of the entrepreneurial attitude that is prevalent throughout the Bay Area is here in this city. But what I learned living in San Francisco, and what I think is true of Austin and was true of Corinth, is that liberty without responsibility is chaos. And creativity without sacrifice is selfishness. You see, I think the Corinthian church and Riverbend Church have a lot in common because Corinth and Austin have a lot in common. Corinth was a city of second chances. Corinth was a place where you went to start anew. Corinth was the place where you could begin again. Corinth was a city that embraced the outcasts and the misfits, just like this city. And the Corinthian church was much like our church. And the advice to the Corinthian church that the Apostle Paul gave them is the advice that he gives to us. That it's not about you. It's not about having, it's about giving. You see, what ChatGPT doesn't understand, the thing that ChatGPT is not as smart as you think it is. What ChatGPT can't calculate is why there isn't a perfect community or why there isn't a perfect society. And I believe because in the imperfection, there is an opportunity. You could say that we are in a church, and we are in a city, we are in a country, we are living in a society that is perfectly imperfect. And that we have been given the opportunity, we have been given the resources, maybe not to make it perfect, But to make it better, you see, we have to give. We get to give. Imagine that.